co-hosted with ACDI. This has also been co-hosted with the Public Health Association of South Africa, whose banner is mysteriously going to materialise when Virginia arrives. Yeah, it's not here yet. And also I'm glad she hasn't seen the very healthy and nutritious food that's been served by ACDI. I won't say anything to pass executive because we're campaigning for a sugar tax in South Africa. We've all been consuming large amounts of sugar. The seminar is really looking at some of the sort of public health aspects of climate change. We're very privileged to have two eminent speakers here who've been visiting. Professor Ahmed Karim is a scientist with the National Council for Science and the Environment in Washington, D.C. He has a long history of environmental activism and the use of science for protecting the environment. And he's an honorary professor with us. And he just walked in with the banner. I want to put up the banner for you, please. And he's been supporting us develop a module stream in our Masters in Public Health on environmental health. And there will be a particular focus on climate change within that stream. And there might even be students who will be doing that. The other speaker is Colin Siscoldi, who is a South African by birth, who left South Africa many years ago. He's a skilled epidemiologist. He's made a name for himself in the field of occupational and environmental health. He's an emeritus professor at the University of Alberta in Canada, and spent time in the US and Canada. And he's now back in South Africa for a brief visit. And might be continuing his visits. He's a member of a national organization called the Collegia Bramazzini, which is a group of scientists who are committed to the use of science for promoting the public good. So with that very cunningly placed and timeless Public Health Association banner, I'm going to ask Karim to kick off. And he'll speak for about 20 minutes, and then Colin will speak, and then we'll have about 20 minutes discussion.
Thank you, Leslie. So, I'm going to be speaking today on denialism is now coming to full flower under our current administration. So what I'm going to try to do today is to give you kind of a broad understanding about what denialism is all about, climate change denialism, and what role it has played in our lives in the last 20 years. So, what exactly is climate change denial? Is it the fossil fuel industry's misinformation campaign, or is it conservative libertarian ideology, or is it just sheer negligence on our part, our modern way of life? Basically, it's a little bit of all of this, but to be frank, it's mostly the first, because there is an ideology that overlaps into misinformation, clearly, and there's also our way of life and our negligence of our way of life. And that sort of a personal way of saying, I will deny that this is actually happening. So we have to keep all of that in mind. So what I'd like to do first is to give you a broad picture of how this community is structured in the United States. And I got this idea from a book which is published back in 2011 by called Oxford Handbook of Climate Change and Society, where they sort of put all this together. And I've just added a few and modified some. The first of all, you have to see the fossil fuel industry, which includes both ExxonMobil, but also electrical utility companies like the Southern Company. Then you also have the American Petroleum Institute that acts as a industry spokesman. The Western Fuel Association, Edison Electric Institute, and so on. Then you have corporate America here, which is the large trade associations like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers, the National Mining Association, and so on. And then, coupled with all of this, are the conservative foundations that are funded by people like the Koch brothers, the Skate Family Control Foundation. Then there is something called the Donors Trust, the Donors Capital Fund. Just keep that one foundation in mind. I'll be talking about in a minute. I won't describe what they do. And then there are other conservative foundations that participate in this whole activity. Then you have these conservative think tanks that they fund, actually. The American Enterprise Institute, the Cato Institute, the George C. Marshall Institute, the Heartland Institute, Competitive Enterprise Institute, and so on. Now, not all these think tanks work on climate change. Climate change is part of their larger agenda. But a few of them, like the Heartland Institute, focuses on climate change. They organize annual meetings and so on. And then you have all these AstroTurf and front groups that are, set up to speak to the public, to go out and organize events, speak to the media, and so on. So you have the Global Climate Coalition, which was a group of industries that set up. They have now become defunct, but at one time they were pretty strong actors here. Then you have a series of different front groups that are sort of spokesmen out in the grassroots community. And some of them speak on television and participate in. And then what you have is then an echo chamber between the media, the blogs, and the politicians. So they just talk to each other, they make a lot of noise, and then it becomes all public. So you've got to keep this in mind. And then you have this kind of big net web of deceit, I call it, between the various different funding agencies, the companies, and so on. You have individuals who actually carry out the task, and then they participate in all kinds of activities with the think tanks and grassroots organizations and so on. They have their own media outlets and blogs and so on. Where does the major funding come from? Climate denial community. Well, as you can see, starting in about 2002, when we have some figures, most of the funding came from Exxon, the Koch brothers, and Donors Trust, at one time, was a small little foundation. Donors Trust is set up in such a way that no one knows where the money comes from. It's an organization where you can put a lot of money, and you don't have to answer to the public, so to speak. So what happened over time, as the agencies, and they got controversial with their funding, like particularly ExxonMobil, noticed that their funding declined to some extent. Koch kept on putting money in, but they started declining. Everyone knows the Koch industries, right? They are a major empire of refineries all over the country. They're involved in so many different petrochemical activities around the country. Some of the most polluting industries are owned by the Koch brothers. But notice the red line, how it has gone up. Because industry and those who support it are providing funding to these deniers by a conduit by which we cannot trace back where the money is coming from. So it's the reason why I mentioned to you, keep in mind the Donors Trust, because that's how they're set up. Now, in terms of looking at the issue of consensus of the people who are climate scientists and those who do not have much background in climate science, it's pretty lopsided. It's not something that you would think from the media. The media thinks that it's kind of a controversy. It's about 50-50. On the one hand this, on the other hand that kind of argument that you hear constantly. And of course, many of the media people who do go and address this question want to always get at least one other person with a different point of view. But if you notice here, these are about 8 or 9 different surveys done, and almost all cases where they have surveyed, you will see that those who believe that humans have a role in global warming, between 84 to 98% of scientists concur with that view, and very few have an opposite position. So when you do an actual survey of where we stand on this issue, not the public, but I'm talking about the people who know about this issue, it makes a very large bit of difference. Now, to just get the overview of it, Bill McKibben, who has worked more on trying to bring the issue of climate science to the public in a kind of an activist mode, I have a quote from him. Exxon helped organize the most consequential lie in human history. He's not putting punches here. And then, of course, I've got a quotation from a Democratic senator, representative from California, saying, it occurred to me that this looks like what happened with the tobacco companies a decade ago. And this was very well documented in a book that Naomi Oreskes, who's a professor of history of science at Harvard University, published back in 2010 called Merchants of Doubt. How many in this room have read Merchants of Doubt? Just a sprinkling. But there's also a movie made of it. And Andrea, she has a copy of this movie. And it's done very well, by the way. It's not just a documentary, but it's done almost Hollywood style. You know, starts off with a conjurer coming. So you're more than welcome to have a look at that. But basically, I have a quotation from that. The problem was that public had no way to know that this contrary evidence was part of an industry campaign designed to confuse. It was, in fact, part of a criminal conspiracy to commit fraud. That's pretty strong language. You know, you don't get a university professor to say something like this. Basically, what she does in this book is to show how the tobacco industry manipulated people and data, how they got funding for the scientists to show to show that tobacco does not kill or make you addictive to the product, and how they organize themselves. Well, it seems to me that what has happened is that the oil and gas industries learned the same technique of trying to obfuscate and blow smoke in your face, literally. So, what is climate change? Is it a hoax? Well, some people think it is a hoax. You can see, it's anytime it snows there, the Republicans come out and say, oh, it's a hoax. But I think that's not really done because of that. And I just put down there, and then you can see how people make equivalents, teaching evolution is a hoax, or bunk, moon landing was a fake, and so forth. But then you see a tweet back in 2012 where Donald Trump said that the concept of global warming was created by the Chinese. And he's saying the same thing today. He has not changed his mind on the Chinese being part of the global conspiracy on climate change. And then I found this cover of Newsweek, which says, global warming is a hoax, asterisk. What does the asterisk say? Or so claim well-funded naysayers who still reject the overwhelming evidence of climate change. And it was written by a very good science writer by the name of Sharon Bagley. So what I have done in this slide today, and it took me a couple of days to do this, is to sit down and develop a new thing called the Climate Change Denialist Hall of Fame. Now, to become a member of the Hall of Fame, you can't just be any old denialist. You've got to be, you know, there's a high threshold there. That's a standard by which you can join the Hall of Fame. You can call it the Hall of Shame if you wish, but Hall of Fame is good enough. And so using that criteria like baseball or basketball, let's look at some of them. First of all, you have Senator James Inhofe, who's now Senate, chairman of the Environment Committee. Let's see his famous quotation. With all the hysteria, all the fear, all the phony science, could it be that man-made global warming is the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people? He puts it in a question. Then look at the quotation from Representative Joe Barton, who served in the past as chairman of the House Senate Energy Conference Committee. Wind is a finite resource, and harnessing would slow the winds down, which would cause the temperature to go up. Please stop. Don't interfere with the wind because we need the breeze. And this is the person who is, these are two people, so they really should belong in the Hall of Fame. The next person, the first person is a tragic story of a scientist, a first-rate scientist, Frederick Seitz, who was formerly the president of the National Academy of Science, president of the Rockefeller University, a first-rate physicist who worked with Eugene Wigner back in the 20s and 30s, doing some first-rate work in the quantum chemistry of solids and all. He's a first-rate scientist. But something happened to him when he became president of Rockefeller University in the 1980s. They received a lot of funding from the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, millions of dollars in research grants. So when he retired from Rockefeller, he put together this NGO called George C. Marshall Institute. And they became an institute that began to continue to receive money from the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company. Became the major organization that tried to deny that secondhand smoke had anything to do with human health. And then slowly from that, he became involved in the climate change issues and the stratospheric ozone issues and all. And he seemed to be always on the opposite side, where this other side data showed the opposite. So he's a tragic case, the person who was once excellent as a scientist, but most of them do not have the stature of Fred Science. Second person that I want to put out here is Steve Malloy. He's an attorney, he's a paid lobbyist for both the tobacco and the fossil fuel industry. He's been doing this for a long time. And he's associated with a think tank called the Cato Institute, and they have a website called Junk Science. Imagine all the junk science all the rest of the world do, junk science, but they don't. And he's a regular commentator on Fox News. So people who watch Fox News hear him all the time. And then there is Myron Ebel, who is with the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and he chairs a group called Cooler Heads Coalition. He led the President Trump's transition team to select the current EPA administrator, Scott Pruitt, who was the former, as you know, Attorney General in Oklahoma, a strong climate change denier. And he's going to dismantle whatever EPA has done in this area. And then we have a kind of a charming rogue. I mean, they can't all be equally evil, but Mark Morano, you will, if you watch the movie The Merchant of Doubt, you will see a lot of chance to be interviewed. He is the editor-in-chief of the Climate Depot, is a website publication. He's a talking head. He's always on on some program on television, not just Fox News. He basically is a huckster. But someone defined him as a magnificent anti-hero, a cheery, chatty prevaricator. And he knows that he is lying. You can see him in the movie, and he enjoys doing it. He actually has no sense of morality first. Then Willie Sohn, a scientist who was trained as an aerospace engineer with the Smithsonian Institution. He used his academic setting to publish a number of articles in peer-reviewed journal on the connection between solar spot cycles, and climate change. His argument is that solar radiation, irradiance, is connected to climate change. Never once did he point out that he received over $1 million in funding from all those industries that are listed above there. Only recently was this made known. And the Smithsonian is now disavowing him. All his papers are now, they have to, I wish they would retract it. Not in a position to do that, but now it's all tainted, obviously. And then we have Christopher Monckton. He is a British peer. He is an advisor and a journalist. For some reason, he's decided that he wants to be a denialist of the first magnitude. But he's a kook, like someone said. To fully appreciate Lord Monckton, you have to keep in mind the sheer volume of kookiness he produces. He is all over the map. He's one of those people who write things, you know, on the website with red pen, full capital, red lines, and blue lines, and this line. And people keep quoting him as if he's some kind of an expert in the field. And my favorite of all time denialist is Fred Singer. He and I locked horns many years ago when we were dealing with the stratospheric ozone and CFC debate. I worked with both Sherry Rowland and Mario Molina to get CFCs both phased out in the US economy and also to move towards the Montreal Treaty. Fred Singer was there arguing against them. And he then, after he lost that battle, you know, Rowland and Molina got the Nobel Prize for their work in 1995 in chemistry. Singer had to get something else to do, so he started working on climate change. So there he is now, today, one of the biggest spokesmen, biggest denialists of all time. He's getting old though. I think his time may be running out. Don't get me started on Fred Singer. So these people belong to the Hall of Fame. All right, so quick. I think I'm going to have to skip these slides because this gives you a little background as to climate change. I call it 101. And I spoke on this topic the last time I was here, and since I'm running out of time, I better stop going into much detail. But just to give you a quick reminder or refresher, sun is the main source of heating. Without water vapor in the atmosphere, this would be a cold planet. But when you start putting more carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, along with the water vapor, you get what is called the greenhouse effect. And then, of course, the sun is at a higher temperature surface. It gives mostly radiation in the visible and ultraviolet range. Earth being much cooler, about for cooler temperature on the surface, gives out mostly radiation in the infrared. And then you have the kind of net effect, Earth's energy balance. And then this is a slide which some of you may understand, but the actual radiation that's going out is in the red. The black body radiation, the theoretical should be the yellow, but because of these different compounds, carbon dioxide, water, and methane, and so on, you get an absorption of the infrared. So climate change basically is these heteroatomic molecules will bind in the infrared. Oxygen and nitrogen are monoatomic. I should say not like, they are the same atoms. They don't vibrate in the infrared. So that's one reason, one thing to keep in mind. Finally, I want to show this slide to show you that most of the heat that is going up is in the ocean. It's not necessarily in the land because the specific heat of water is so much greater than of soil and so forth. So 93% of the heating that's going on in the climate is happening in the oceans. And here are some, this is just a quick slide to tell you what are the, telltale signatures of global warming. And you know the basic one, losing glaciers, Arctic ice melt, rising sea level rise, and so on. Okay, so here are some of the major arguments that, and I'm going to take one by one. Carbon dioxide is only a trace gas in the atmosphere. It is. It's only 0.02%. But even though oxygen is 80%, nitrogen 80% oxygen, they don't absorb in the infrared. It's all these other compounds that do. Water vapor is a major greenhouse gas not taken into account in most discussions of climate change. I'll talk about this next. Then, it's mostly caused by natural variability like sunspot cycles and cosmic rays. Or there has been a slowdown, a hiatus since 1998 in global warming. What about the hacked email that shows that scientists manipulating data? And then, of course, most of the climatologists have raised alarm about global warming because they want to raise funds for their research. Well, let's look at the data, actually. So, first of all, I'm going to show you carbon dioxide concentration trends in global warming. This is the most current data. As late as March 9, 2017, it's now 405 parts per million. And that green line there tells you 400. Up to now, it's been down in the high 300s. So this is the so-called Keeling curve that you see. If you go back and collect data from the Antarctic ice core, you will see this picture. You will see that the rise of temperature and the rise of CO2 go together. But what is more telling is if you go 800,000 years, you see that the concentration of carbon dioxide has never gone above 300. We're now already 400. And if you don't continue, that if you look at the lower emission scenario, you could go as much as 550 and can go as high as 900. So keep in mind when you look, and I hope Colin is going to tell us all about the consequences of this. Okay, I will skip this one. Basically, this is a little too, I don't have much time, but basically tell you why water is a greenhouse gas, but it condenses, it only stays in the atmosphere for about 10 days. Carbon dioxide, methane all stay up there for decades, as much as centuries. Anytime you put something up there, they don't come back. So if they are absorbed in the infrared, it will continue increasing. If you keep increasing the temperature. So what the net result is carbon dioxide causes global warming, that increases the temperature, increases water vapor, so you get a nonlinear amplification of. Okay, now look at this one. This is the latest data we have on global climate change. Now 2015 and 2016 is the last data there. It's basically going up that way. Now notice, here's something very important for you to notice. There are humps when the thing sort of levels off a little bit here. It leveled off here in the early 20s, 2000. It leveled off quite a bit here in this period of time because there's a lot of volcanic emissions of particulate matter. This is how industry statisticians looked at the data. They looked at data from 1997 to 2015 and said, oh, there's been no increase whatsoever. Because they took the data here, it was an abnormal year of very hot 1938. Just drew this line here. They didn't go back too far. Now, if you do it correctly, this is what you find if you globally average all the temperatures from 1880 to now. This is the zero. Look at it. It's been going up all along. The trend is upwards. But they only use for this little period of time. If you look at the data, if you go back again, you can take any decade if you want. You can always show there's been no trend upwards. 2016 turns out to be one of the hottest years ever been recorded. And this is a map of the world to show you where extremely record warm. So many places in our planet have it. Okay. I'll just be another 2 minutes. Natural variability is the main cause of global warming. All right, let's look at the sunspot side. Here you have, this is the temperature averaged over, these are yearly temperatures, as you can see the light red, and these are 11-year average numbers. Same thing with solar irradiance. Up to about 1960 and so forth, they seem to be sort of coincidentally going up like this. But after that, it's been leveling off here, regardless of what the annual 11-year cycle looks like. And if we average it out, there's no correlation between solar irradiance and global warming. The same thing with cosmic rays. Same kind of, this is temperature going up there, cosmic ray incidence on Earth has not kept up with. So basically, and then finally, I should mention to you about climate gate. I cannot finish this presentation without talking about this email. Remember the hacked emails back in 2009? They said, oh, and this is the man who they went after, Tom Wigley. He was a professor now at University of Adelaide in Australia. But he was the director of the climate research unit at the University of East Anglia, UK. One of the world's top, absolutely top climate scientists. No, he's probably the most honored climate scientist. But they hacked into his, and it turns out that these hacked, they were able to find some servers in Russia and Saudi Arabia, where apparently they could never pinpoint to a particular person. So what they did was, 8 independent committees looked into the question and found no basis for saying that there was a dishonest by any of them. They took a couple of words like trick or decline within the emails and then took it completely out of context and made a claim that they were manipulating data. Now, trick is used by many statisticians to say, this is how I do my work. Here's a neat way of doing analysis. But somehow the other they were able to fool the public and the media. So, this is the kind of the bottom line on man-made. Carbon dioxide, you've got methane, you've got halocarbons, you've got tropospheric ozone. All of them provide you with the net amount of heating. Then you've got some cloud cover, and you've got particulate matter that may cause cooling. And then this is the total irradiance, you might say, contribution. Net result is the anthropogenic component is the highest in terms of climate change. And here is a graph that tells you the more expertise you have in climate science, the more you believe that human cause global warming. The less background you have in climate science, the more likely you will say, oh, it may be, maybe this, maybe that. So I want to just summarize, end my talk by telling you what are the consequences of climate change denial. It's ethically indefensible. It's scientifically disgraceful, societally irresponsible, ecologically heartbreaking because so many species are going to go extinct, and globally unpardonable. That is what it is, and I hope Colin will give us the reason to believe this. One last thing before I ask Colin to speak. I want to give you one positive word. This came out of an article last fall in Guardian. The future belongs to clean energy. I just want to have an excerpt. There's a picture of a Maasai herdsman with wind energy powers in the background. In fact, by 2030, clean energy is expected to overtake fossil fuels, become the largest source of global electricity production. And hope that it's going to be right, regardless of what's happening today in our administration in the United States and other parts of the world. Thank you very much.
I just want to suggest you hold your questions till afterwards, and we'll take Colin's input and then
Well, I'll start while we find the talk. I'll just let you know that everything I'm going to tell you today on these slides will be posted onto my website in the next couple of days, and the archive on my personal website, colinsascolny.com, is where you can find what I'm saying, and there are live links in that talk to find the primary sources in relation to what I'm saying. Where's the
Pointer?
pointer?
Okay.
Thank you.
It's a good one, isn't it? Long.
Okay, so this is where you'll find it under the archive there. As Leslie asked me to speak to this particular topic, global environmental and climate change, I must just start off by saying that I worry a lot about climate change taking all the attention. My focus from a public health point of view is much more on global changes, of which climate change is a part, and I'll explain where that's coming from in just a moment. First of all, I do want to acknowledge the Club of Rome in 1972 produced a major paper translated into many languages, denied by many ideological think tanks as not worthy of consideration, but nonetheless being proven to be correct in certain of its scenarios. A paper called Limits to Growth. And then Anthony J. McMichael, also from Adelaide, Australia originally, but I think while he was at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, produced a book called Planetary Overload, Global Environmental Change and the Health of the Human Species. Now this particular book is the one that got me to rivet my attention away from my narrow focus on occupational cancer epidemiology and more community epidemiology to the global environment, looking more at the upstream determinants. So where does this concern come from? What is epidemiology? In brief, we study where diseases occur, why they are occurring, and we study populations. Our concern is not so much on the individual patients, so not so much the physician-patient relationship, but the community medical officer of health or the community examiner in concern with population and community health. And our focus is on preventing harms to populations. So I ask you, based on what you've just heard from the physics of it all and from the denial machine that's there, what greater concern could there be for saving human populations than these kinds of issues? So our job in epidemiology is to inform policy. So we work at the nexus or the interface of research and we translate it to policy. We do this because we're the science that is capable of taking the work from animal studies done in petri dishes and so on, or experimental animals in some kind of trial, and we translate that information into the human experience and then can inform policy on the basis of substantive data. So the question that emerges from all of this is how can we more effectively deliver on this obligation to inform policy correctly? And I think from what you can see, we're losing the battle. We have actually lost the battle in the United States. They have just elected somebody. Well, they elected George W. Bush before, and since Ronald Reagan, this major right-wing ideological approach to science denial in preference to ideological goals. And these tend to be sociopathic, psychopathic, and very much that we should be working hard to protect the planet from. So in public health, we focus on 4 different levels of prevention. I won't go into them in great detail because we are a bit short of time, but can we prevent large-scale effects? The first, the most common, until the World Health Organization put out a book by Beaglehole in the 1980s or 90s, these were the 3 levels of prevention, primary, secondary, and tertiary, until they identified in that book primordial prevention, which really speaks to the serious upstream determinants of public health. Primary prevention comes about, and I'll just focus on that one, well maybe I'll mention the other 2 because it's interesting. My favorite discipline is epidemiology, and what I'm trained in. Primary prevention is where people have access to tobacco, and what we try to do in public health is make them aware of the harms of smoking, and that they, by quitting smoking, will reduce their risk of becoming ill, or ideally not to become addicted in the first place. Secondary prevention is screening programs where we identify people early on, and you're all probably aware that when people do have a cancer process going on, if you pick it up early and you can intervene, you might prevent them from dying as a consequence of that process. Tertiary prevention is rehabilitation successfully so that people picked up in good time can be functional and happy, productive people in society. But I'm focusing here on the serious upstream determinants, the kinds of things that you've just heard all about. Why are these things going wrong? Now, for all of us in training, for those of us that haven't identified the career path that we want to focus on, I want to point to 3 particular levels at which we can operate. We can operate at the micro level, that is like the physician-patient, the nurse practitioner-patient relationship, where we work on the ground one-to-one with people. We can alternatively have the personality or the skill set that allows us to work at the meso-lens level, that is at the community level, at a slightly higher level than on the ground. Or we might choose to work looking at the world through a macro lens at the country or world level from an elevation of, say, 10,000 meters at the height of a plane flying, and then we advocate for global health. So you can pick, and I say to all young people that I've ever taught, find your passion. All 3 of these are equally important. Don't be afraid if you don't have this skill or that skill. Work hard to be as precise and accurate and true to your science as what you can be at any of these 3 levels. Now, I said I would say something about global change because when climate change became a major focus about 15 years ago, that was, I may have been one of the first to point out that this topic of global change was being hijacked by climate change. Why do I talk about this? Well, we've seen and heard about the geoclimatic system changes that are taking place. Population growth is another big problem in the world. The expansion of consumption-intensive lifestyles is a big problem. Increasing global and within-country disparities is another problem. We're seeing fresh water declines everywhere. We talk about ecotoxicity of these systems raging everywhere. Species are becoming extinct everywhere. And we're committed to this growth-bound paradigm, which seems to be very much entrenched. Systemically, and hence institutionally, we see serious problems arising. And this is to bring us to focus on ourselves. What role have we, have the colleagues, this Hall of Shame, Hall of Fame, whatever you want to call it, how do these people come to sell their souls to the devil after being fantastic scientists, incredibly good, and then suddenly they're providing expert testimony for defense counsels to tell you that asbestos doesn't cause harm, tobacco doesn't cause harm, climate change isn't a problem. We have to look to ourselves, to how we become seduced enough to the mega, and of course it's money. Follow money and you will find the source of most of these problems. And way back in 1983, when I completed my doctoral, when I left South Africa, I went to the States to do my doctoral thesis, and it was actually funded then by Exxon. It was then Exxon, not ExxonMobil. I was very well treated. At that time, Jimmy Carter was the president of, was the president of the United States, and he was seen as a peanut farmer, but a much left of center president, seemed to be about 30 or 40 or 60 years before his time. And at that time, it behooved industry to be seen to be doing good by way of its workers. I ran into a huge problem. I found a problem with one of the chemicals that they were producing at Exxon in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And as soon as I produced this result, it was denied by the corporation. Why? Not because the science was bad. They, of course, said the science was bad. But it was denied because Jimmy Carter had been replaced by Ronald Reagan, and no longer was the dominant paradigm one of being seen to be doing good for workers, but rather to be protecting corporate interests. That's my interpretation of what happened. And indeed, this was reinforced a couple of years later after I'd run into tremendous obstacles to try to make sure that my thesis would be approved, where Clayson and Halpin state, industry's offensive against the regulation of health and safety hazards uses academics to downplay or deny the seriousness of the hazards. And this is what feeds into this seduction to large amounts of money. The Ford Pinto experience in the United States, which was found where Ford Pintos were exploding, there were some people who were put on retainer to the tune of $20 million US a year to stand up in court and deny and deceive and foment doubt, and cast doubt and foment uncertainty. So the classic technique then used by people with profound vested interest in what one comes up with as evidence is that they will either deny, they will start off usually by denying that what you have found is indeed true. If you persist and you're tenacious enough, they will then try to cause delays, and how they do this is they offer you more money. And they say, because you're a scientist, you like to count things and you like to measure things, so here's another few $100,000, go and do another study and come back in 3 or 4 years' time when you've got more data. While they're doing that, and of course most scientists rise to the occasion because it's an opportunity for more funding and to keep doing research. And it's the only way to get through to them. So sometimes it's a good decision and sometimes it's not a good decision to take that money. But again, I'm saying that we need to look to ourselves as to how we're on this trajectory that we're on. They'll offer other scientists money who will actually design, epidemiology as a soft science, so you can design studies with control groups and experimental groups in such a way that you can show that asbestos may be good for you, or Teflon is good for you, or tobacco is good for you. You can actually design studies to do that, and people will actually do that, and have done it. And the Oreskes-Conway book that's been turned into a docudrama shows that vividly. If indeed they've been able to buy scientists to lie, then that creates division, the green word there. And if you still persist, they will then try to discredit you. And in case you're thinking that this is not in any way true, there are wonderful movies on this topic. They'll try to dismiss you, they'll even cause death, as you might have seen in this movie, Silkwood with Meryl Streep, and Julia Roberts in Erin Brockovich. These are just 2 examples, and there are many more such instances that bring this to public attention. How ethical then is all of this? Well, we need to look again to ourselves as members of society. Now, we mustn't blame the victim. We are all the victims as I see it, and it's dangerous in public health to blame the victim because the reasons for our behaviors are often systemic and institutional. But if we look at comparing average consumption around the world, the last time I looked at this, and the data is a bit out of date, but it's just getting worse in the trend. The USA has an enormous ecological footprint, growing by nearly 100% in that short period. Canada growing not quite as fast. India doubling, but much lower than the mean entitlement, which is about 1.8 hectares per person in the world. But you can see that we're in an overshoot position globally by some 50%, and again, that's worsening all the time. If we look at the ethical and social justice dimensions of climate change in particular, you can see from this cartogram. Cartogram is a world map that's where the countries are drawn on the basis of proportional contribution to a problem. So you can see this map is completely, look at Africa here, it's very tiny, but on most maps it's very big. But here you can see it's much bigger. But in the upper map you can see that these are the contributions of tons of carbon to the upper atmosphere, so the so-called rich global north, mostly, and the people that are suffering the consequences are mainly in Africa. And about 15 years ago, the World Health Organization's estimate through climate refugees was that about 100,000 Africans were dying per year because of climate change, caused not by them, but by other people. So this results in major conflict in international settings where you bring different parties, the rich north, the global south around the table, and you try to have some level of mediation, but you've got the global south saying, but it's your fault, and you've got the global north saying, well, you fix it, or we don't assume responsibility. But here you can see in 2009 at I think it was the Paris, no, where was this meeting? Well, anyway, you can see that the China and India attack Western climate people as hypocrites, and then in the next slide I just want to show you that the ever-growing gap between rich and poor that I pointed out earlier is something well recognized now with the advent in 2000 of the global, what's it? Who can help me with that?
The SDG.
The sustainability, but before
Development goals,
the Millennium, thank you, the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals came out in 2000. were a hopeless failure by 2015, replaced in 2016 with the Sustainability Development Goals. What are we talking about with this kind of disparity? And you'll see some statistics for where South Africa fits into this globally. So you can see the Gini coefficient is a measure of disparities, and it's a ratio between 0 and 1, and we usually multiply by 100 because it's easier to think as percentages. It's defined as a ratio with values between 0 and 1. 0 corresponds to perfect equality, where everyone has the exact level of income across the board. And 1 corresponds to perfect inequality, where one person has all the income while everyone else has 0. Well, let's look at how we all shape up in this. Japan does pretty well, closer to 1. Well, Sweden, you can see, getting progressively more unequal. The United Kingdom, Iran, the United States, Argentina, Mexico, South Africa, Namibia, just to show you some examples of inequality. Again, what is our role in public health in trying to deal with this? Now, this is a lovely expression. A picture tells 1,000 words. There are none so blind as those who will not see. And you can see this fat cat over here and the worker bee below. And disparity, I don't see it. Top CEOs earn more than 180 times more than average Canadians. And that's Canada the Good, as it's called. Now, the planet is at its hottest in 115,000 years thanks to climate change. So I'm bringing us back now to climate change. And this point was made by James Hansen, who's probably the person most responsible for bringing this to attention and taking great risk with his career in the United States and having suffered huge consequences, but has contributed enormously to bringing attention to this issue. So 2016 temperature is likely to be 1.25 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times, following a warming trend where the world has heated up at a rate of 0.18 degrees Celsius per decade over the past 45 years. The temperature increase above which humanity cannot survive or endure. It's important to understand this. The link between rapid climate change and human extinction is basically this. The planet becomes uninhabitable by humans if the average temperature goes up by 4 to 6 degrees Celsius. Now, I think anyone who has any knowledge of public health would know that this represents a very serious public health threat. Talking of reductions of, if you read James Hansen, not James Hansen, oh gosh, sorry, I need my slides, but I didn't include it. Anyway, there's a wonderful author from England who wrote his book, The Final Warning, who points out that we're likely to see a reduction from about 9 or 10 billion at that point down to perhaps a few 100,000 people. That's a very serious problem. And remember, when we talk about global temperatures, we're talking about a global average temperature. There will be, as you saw on the globe shown